The notification that shattered Jessica Rodriguez's quiet morning at 0530 hours wasn't supposed to reach her terminal. As an IT support technician at Fort Cascade's 47th Communications and Cyber Warfare Division, she dealt with password resets and printer malfunctions, not classified intelligence alerts. But there it was, blinking red on her screen like a digital scream. Imminent cyber attack, all systems compromised. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, muscle memory from another life taking over as she traced the intrusion's digital fingerprints. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't some random hacker or foreign intelligence probe. This was a coordinated assault by professional cyber terrorists, designed to cripple military communications during Operation Desert Shield, where American forces were currently engaged in active combat operations overseas. In exactly 43 minutes, every communication system supporting troops in the field would go dark, leaving soldiers blind, deaf, and defenseless against enemy forces who had been planning this moment for months. And the only person who recognized the threat was a woman her colleagues dismissed as barely competent to troubleshoot email problems. The fluorescent lights in the Fort Cascade Communications Center hummed with the same monotonous frequency that had marked Jessica Rodriguez's days for the past 14 months. At 26, she moved through the sterile corridors with the deliberate invisibility of someone who had learned that drawing attention in this environment meant inviting ridicule. Her regulation uniform hung loose on her 5'6" frame, and her dark hair remained perpetually pulled back in a bun, so tight it had become her defining characteristic among the 180 personnel stationed at this remote Colorado facility. Fort Cascade itself perched precariously on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, a collection of reinforced concrete buildings and satellite arrays that looked like someone had dropped a piece of the future onto an unforgiving landscape. The base served as the nerve center for military communications across 3 time zones, monitoring everything from routine supply, convoy coordination to classified intelligence operations that determined the fate of soldiers fighting in conflicts most Americans never heard about on the evening news. Jessica's workstation occupied the far corner of the main communications floor, positioned strategically where the important people wouldn't have to see her unless absolutely necessary. Her desk bore the accumulated evidence of her assigned role: towers of outdated computer manuals, cables that needed organizing, and requisition forms for equipment that would probably be obsolete before it arrived. The morning routine never varied. Check overnight system logs, respond to help desk tickets about forgotten passwords, and maintain the appearance of being busy enough to justify her existence but not so competent as to threaten anyone's assumptions about her capabilities. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so professionally devastating. Every piece of equipment she touched functioned flawlessly after her attention, not because she followed standard procedures, but because she understood network architecture and cybersecurity at levels that would have impressed the Pentagon's most senior analysts. Her modifications to the base communication protocols had improved system efficiency by 12% over the past year, improvements that were attributed to routine maintenance rather than innovative engineering. Sergeant Major Robert Hayes embodied everything Jessica had learned to avoid during her time at Fort Cascade. At 48, he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had spent 25 years in the military and never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through volume and intimidation. His office overlooked the main floor like a panopticon, allowing him to monitor every movement while radiating disapproval that could be felt from 3 rooms away. His morning inspections had become theater for the entertainment of junior personnel who enjoyed watching someone else receive the daily dose of institutional humiliation. Rodriguez, His voice cut through the morning air with the precision of a blade designed specifically for psychological warfare. "Those server maintenance logs better be completed when I check them at 0900. And I mean actually completed, not your usual half-hearted attempt at looking busy." She didn't respond because 14 months of experience had taught her that any reaction, positive or negative, would only extend the performance. Instead, she nodded once and returned to her keyboard, where she was actually running advanced diagnostic routines on the base's entire network infrastructure, identifying vulnerabilities and patch requirements that the official IT security team wouldn't discover for weeks. The other soldiers in the communications center had long since learned to treat her presence like background noise, occasionally useful but generally irrelevant to their important work. Corporal Tyler Brooks, a 23-year-old from Michigan whose primary qualification seemed to be an encyclopedic knowledge of military regulations combined with complete ignorance of their practical application, had appointed himself as Hayes's unofficial enforcement mechanism. "Hey, Rodriguez," Brooks called from across the room, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that had become the soundtrack of her daily existence. "My computer's running slow again. Think you can figure out how to restart it without breaking anything?" The laughter that followed was predictable, like a sitcom laugh track that played on cue. Brooks's computer wasn't running slowly because of technical problems. She diagnosed the issue weeks ago. He was running cryptocurrency mining software during duty hours, using military resources for personal profit, while blaming the resulting performance issues on equipment failure. Pointing this out would require explaining how she'd conducted network analysis that was technically beyond her authorization level, so she simply walked over to perform the requested restart while mentally cataloging another piece of evidence. That would eventually contribute to a much larger reckoning. What nobody at Fort Cascade knew, what nobody in her current chain of command had been told, was that Jessica Rodriguez had spent 3 years as a Delta Force communications specialist before her career was derailed by a single incident that had nothing to do with her technical capabilities and everything to do with institutional politics that treated competence as a threat rather than an asset. Her real training had taken place in facilities that didn't appear on any official maps, working with equipment that defense contractors only dreamed about. She had coordinated communications for operations in hostile territories where a single technical failure could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic international incidents. Her innovations in field communications and cyber warfare had been classified at levels that required congressional oversight, and her ability to penetrate enemy networks had made her one of the most valuable specialists in unconventional warfare. The downfall had come during a training exercise at the Cyber Warfare Academy, where her commanding officer had discovered that her solutions to complex network security problems were consistently more elegant and effective than those developed by officers with advanced degrees and decades of experience. Rather than recognizing exceptional ability, he had concluded that she must be receiving unauthorized assistance or using techniques that violated operational security protocols. The investigation that followed had been thorough, professional, and completely predetermined. Her methods were deemed unconventional, her results inconsistent with established procedures, and her attitude unsuitable for advanced technical positions requiring absolute adherence to protocol. The recommendation for reassignment had been phrased in language that ensured she would never again be considered for positions that matched her actual capabilities. Staff Sergeant Michael Chun represented the closest thing to an ally that Jessica had discovered during her exile at Fort Cascade. At 31, he moved through the communications center with the quiet competence of someone who had learned that true expertise often required diplomatic invisibility. His background in signal intelligence had given him the analytical skills to recognize that her equipment maintenance resulted in performance improvements that couldn't be explained by routine procedures. "Morning, Jessica," he said quietly, settling into the workstation adjacent to hers, with a coffee that smelled suspiciously like the premium blend that wasn't available in the regular mess hall. Anything interesting in the overnight logs? It was a routine question that had developed layers of meaning over the months. Chun had begun asking not because he expected routine answers, but because he had noticed that her analysis of system performance often identified issues before they became critical problems. His casual inquiries had become an informal, early warning system that had prevented 3 major network failures and countless minor disruptions. "Server cluster 7 is showing latency spikes," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Nothing critical yet, but the pattern suggests we might want to check the cooling system before it becomes a problem." Chun nodded, making a note that would result in maintenance being performed that afternoon, preventing what would have otherwise become a system failure during peak operational hours. Their collaboration had developed carefully, structured, to avoid drawing attention from supervisors who might interpret professional competence as insubordination or evidence of unauthorized activity. The morning briefing at 0800 hours was conducted in the main conference room, where Captain Linda Morrison delivered updates on global communications traffic and operational priorities, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned to manage competing demands from multiple command structures. At 42, Morrison had risen through the ranks by demonstrating reliability rather than brilliance, making decisions that satisfied regulatory requirements while avoiding the political complications that destroyed careers. "Current operational tempo remains high," Morrison announced, consulting her tablet with the focused attention of someone reading from a script. "Operation Desert Shield continues to require enhanced communication support, and we're tracking increased cyber activity from hostile nations attempting to probe our networks." Jessica listened with the external appearance of routine attention, while mentally cataloging details that revealed significant gaps in the official intelligence picture. The briefing described cyber threats in general terms that suggested the briefing officers didn't understand the sophisticated nature of current attack methodologies. References to increased activity actually indicated coordinated probing operations that were testing specific vulnerabilities in military communication protocols. "Rodriguez," Morrison's voice interrupted her analysis, "you'll be handling routine maintenance on the backup communication systems today. Chun will brief you on the specific requirements." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The assignment was typical, important enough to require someone with technical skills, routine enough to be delegated to personnel who weren't considered critical for primary operations. What Morrison didn't realize was that the backup systems maintained by Jessica had become the most secure and reliable components of the entire network infrastructure, protected by security enhancements that she had implemented during supposedly routine maintenance procedures. As the briefing concluded and personnel dispersed to their assigned duties, Jessica remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, reviewing the implications of information that had been presented as routine updates. The patterns she was identifying suggested coordination between cyber threats and operational schedules that indicated a level of intelligence penetration that should have triggered immediate security alerts. The walk back to her workstation took her past the secured SERVER room, where the base's most critical systems were housed behind reinforced doors and biometric access controls. Her clearance allowed entry for routine maintenance, but her actual activities in that room would have surprised supervisors, who assumed she was simply replacing failed components and running standard diagnostic routines. Her real work began after the morning briefing, when the communications center settled into its daily rhythm of monitoring traffic and maintaining connections that kept military operations functioning across multiple time zones. While her colleagues focused on immediate operational requirements, Jessica conducted systematic analysis of network traffic patterns that revealed threats developing beneath the surface of routine communications. The first anomaly appeared at 847 hours, buried in routine data packet analysis that would normally be reviewed by automated systems and filed without human examination. Jessica's enhanced monitoring protocols had been designed to identify subtle variations that might indicate coordinated cyber reconnaissance, and what she discovered made her pause in the middle of what appeared to be routine system maintenance. Someone was conducting systematic reconnaissance of military communication protocols, using techniques sophisticated enough to avoid detection by standard security monitoring. The probing operations were distributed across multiple entry points and timed to coincide with periods of high legitimate traffic, making them nearly invisible to conventional analysis. Only someone with her background in advanced cyber warfare would recognize the patterns that indicated professional-level intelligence operations. Her training kicked in automatically, the same analytical processes that had made her valuable in Delta Force operations, now applied to threats that her current colleagues wouldn't recognize until they had already achieved their objectives. The reconnaissance pattern suggested preparation for a major assault on military communication systems, timed to coincide with operational periods when communication failures would have maximum impact on troops in the field. As she traced the digital fingerprints of the reconnaissance activity, Jessica realized that she was looking at preparation for an attack that would cripple communications during Operation Desert Shield, leaving American forces vulnerable at exactly the moment when they would be most dependent on secure communications for coordination and support. The sophistication of the preparation indicated months of planning by professionals who understood military communication protocols and had access to intelligence about operational schedules. The morning continued with routine activities that masked her growing concern about threats that were developing beyond the awareness of her colleagues and supervisors. Her position as an invisible support technician provided perfect cover for the kind of deep analysis that would have attracted unwanted attention if conducted by someone whose opinions carried official weight. By 10:30 hours, she had confirmed her worst fears. The cyber reconnaissance wasn't random probing by opportunistic hackers. It was systematic preparation for a coordinated attack designed to coincide with the most critical phase of ongoing military operations, when communication failures would result in casualties that could be prevented only by someone who recognized the threat and possessed the technical skills to counter it. The question that would define everything that followed was simple and terrible. Would she risk exposure by acting on intelligence that her current position didn't authorize her to possess, or would she remain invisible while soldiers died because the people responsible for their protection didn't understand the sophistication of the threats they were facing? The fluorescent lights continued their monotonous humming, marking time toward a crisis that only she could see coming. The secure server room at Fort Cascade maintained a constant temperature of 68 degrees, the subtle hum of cooling systems creating white noise that masked conversations from electronic surveillance. Jessica had discovered months ago that the room's acoustic properties made it the perfect location for conducting analysis that required absolute concentration, away from the casual interruptions and constant oversight that characterized the main communications floor. Her afternoon maintenance routine provided legitimate cover for activities that would have raised uncomfortable questions if conducted at her regular workstation. While her colleagues assumed she was performing routine hardware diagnostics, Jessica was actually conducting deep packet analysis of network traffic patterns that revealed threats developing beneath the surface of normal military communications. The reconnaissance activity she had identified that morning was accelerating, becoming bolder and more systematic as the day progressed. What had begun as subtle probing operations was evolving into active intelligence gathering that suggested immediate preparation for a major cyber assault. The sophistication of the techniques indicated professional cyber warfare specialists working with detailed knowledge of military communication protocols and operational schedules. Jessica's fingers moved across the keyboard with fluid precision, executing commands that traced digital pathways through multiple layers of network infrastructure. Her analysis revealed coordination between seemingly unrelated cyber activities, occurring across different military installations, all following patterns that indicated centralized planning and professional execution. The attack being prepared wasn't targeting Fort Cascade specifically. It was designed to cripple military communications supporting Operation Desert Shield during the most critical phase of ongoing combat operations. The tactical implications were staggering. American forces currently engaged in active operations relied on secure communications for everything from artillery coordination to medical evacuation requests. A successful cyber attack during combat operations wouldn't just disrupt communications. It would result in casualties that could be measured in hundreds of lives lost due to coordination failures, friendly fire incidents, and delayed medical support. Her Delta Force training had included extensive education about asymmetric warfare tactics, where technologically sophisticated enemies use cyber weapons to neutralize conventional military advantages. The attack patterns she was identifying matched theoretical scenarios that intelligence analysts had warned about for years, but this was the first time she had seen evidence of such an operation being implemented in real time against active American military operations. The clock on her workstation showed 13:47 hours when the first phase of the attack began. Jessica watched through her monitoring systems as cyber infiltrators began systematic penetration of communication networks supporting overseas operations, moving with the precise timing that indicated months of careful planning and detailed intelligence about operational schedules. Her training kicked in automatically, the same analytical processes that had made her valuable in special operations, now focused on understanding threats that her current colleagues wouldn't recognize until they had already achieved catastrophic success. The infiltrators were using advanced persistent threat techniques, establishing permanent access to military networks while remaining undetected by standard security monitoring systems. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the timing. Operation Desert Shield was entering its most critical phase, where communication failures could result in troops being abandoned without support during active engagement with enemy forces. The cyber attackers had clearly timed their assault to coincide with periods when American forces would be most vulnerable to coordination disruptions. Jessica's analysis revealed that the attack was being conducted in carefully orchestrated phases designed to avoid triggering automatic security responses until the final assault phase rendered defensive measures ineffective. The infiltrators had been positioning themselves for weeks, possibly months, establishing access and understanding network architecture before launching the coordinated attack that would cripple military communications when they were most desperately needed. Staff Sergeant Chun appeared in the server room doorway at 14:25 hours, his expression carrying the concerned focus of someone who had learned to recognize when routine activities were actually urgent problems requiring immediate attention. His background in signal intelligence had given him the analytical skills to understand that Jessica's extended time in the secure facility indicated something more significant than routine maintenance. "Everything okay in here?" he asked quietly, closing the door behind him and speaking in tones that wouldn't carry beyond the room's acoustic boundaries. "You've been running diagnostics for 3 hours, and your facial expression suggests the results aren't routine." Jessica hesitated for a moment, calculating the risks of sharing information that could compromise her carefully maintained cover while weighing those risks against the consequences of allowing the cyber attack to proceed without intervention. Chun had demonstrated both technical competence and discretion during their months of informal collaboration, but what she was about to reveal would require trust at levels that could destroy both their careers if handled incorrectly. "Michael," she said finally, using his first name for the first time since arriving at Fort Cascade. I need you to look at something. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you is significantly beyond what my official clearance authorizes me to access. Chun's expression sharpened with the focused attention of someone who understood that certain conversations carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate professional relationships. He moved closer to her workstation, positioning himself where he could see her analysis while maintaining visual contact with the door. "Show me," he said simply. Jessica began walking him through her discovery, explaining the reconnaissance patterns and attack preparation with the technical precision that had characterized her special operations briefings. As her analysis revealed the scope and sophistication of the cyber assault being prepared, Chun's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm. "This is targeting Desert Shield communications," he said quietly, the implications sinking in as he reviewed her data. "If they succeed during active operations, troops in the field will lose coordination, artillery support, medical evacuation. People are going to die. People are definitely going to die unless someone stops this," Jessica confirmed. "The attack is scheduled to begin in approximately 6 hours, timed to coincide with tonight's major operational phase, when communication requirements will be at their highest level." Chun was quiet for several minutes, studying her analysis while processing information that revealed threats far beyond anything discussed in official briefings. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful weight of someone who understood that decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether they were heroes or criminals in the eyes of military justice. "Jessica, the level of analysis you've conducted here, the depth of network penetration you've achieved to gather this intelligence, this isn't something that an IT support technician could accomplish with standard training and authorized access. You want to tell me who you really are?" The question she had been dreading for 14 months had finally arrived, delivered by the one person at Fort Cascade who might actually understand the answer. Jessica looked at Chun directly, making the decision that would either save lives or destroy her carefully constructed anonymity. Delta Force Communications Specialist, 3 years active in unconventional operations, reassigned after an incident at the Cyber Warfare Academy. That had nothing to do with my technical capabilities and everything to do with institutional politics. That couldn't accept that my solutions were better than those developed by officers with advanced degrees. Chun nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle that had been troubling him for months finally falling into place. Her exceptional maintenance results, her ability to identify problems before they became critical, her comprehensive understanding of network architecture that far exceeded what her position should have required. "What happened at the academy?" he asked. "I developed penetration techniques that consistently outperformed established protocols during training exercises. Instead of recognizing innovation, my commanding officer concluded I must be violating security procedures or receiving unauthorized assistance. The investigation found my methods unconventional and my results inconsistent with established procedures. I was reassigned to positions where my actual capabilities couldn't threaten anyone's assumptions about proper protocols." The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. The same institution that had buried her talents because they were too advanced for comfortable integration was now facing threats that only those advanced capabilities could counter effectively. "What do you need?" Chun asked, his voice carrying the commitment of someone who understood that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary decisions. "I need access to the primary communication servers and authorization to implement countermeasures that will prevent the attack from succeeding. What I don't need is someone asking questions about my methods or requiring explanations about techniques that aren't covered in standard operating procedures." Chun considered this for a moment, weighing professional protocols against the lives that hung in the balance. "The countermeasures you're planning, are they going to be traceable back to Unauthorized activities? Everything I do will be traceable to someone with advanced cyber warfare training, conducting defensive operations against foreign intelligence threats. The question is whether anyone is going to investigate those activities or simply be grateful that the attack was prevented. And if they do investigate? Jessica's expression carried the grim determination of someone who had already calculated the personal costs of necessary action. Then I'll face whatever consequences come from preventing American soldiers from dying due to communication failures during combat operations. I've been buried professionally for 14 months because of institutional politics. I'm not going to let those same politics result in casualties that I have the skills to prevent. Chun was quiet for another long moment, mentally reviewing everything he knew about Jessica's work over the past months, her exceptional results, and her comprehensive understanding of systems that officially exceeded her clearance level. When he made his decision, it was with the same tactical clarity that had served him during signal intelligence operations in hostile territories. What do you need me to do? I need you to ensure that our activities in this room aren't interrupted for the next 4 hours while I implement countermeasures that will protect military communications during tonight's operational phase. If anyone asks what we're doing, we're conducting emergency security updates in response to identified threats. That's actually accurate, Chun pointed out. Completely accurate. The question is whether anyone will accept that explanation from people who aren't officially authorized to conduct that level of security analysis. Chun moved to the door, checking the corridor before engaging the electronic lock that would prevent casual interruptions. Consider this room secured for emergency maintenance activities. Anyone who wants access will need to go through both of us. Jessica returned to her analysis with renewed focus, knowing that she now had both the support she needed and the time required to implement countermeasures that could prevent catastrophic communication failures during active military operations. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years working under pressure where technical failures meant operational disasters. The cyber attack was sophisticated, but it followed patterns that she had encountered during special operations training. The attackers were using advanced persistent threat techniques, but they had made the fundamental error of assuming that their targets would be defended only by standard military cybersecurity protocols. They weren't prepared for countermeasures developed by someone with her background in unconventional cyber warfare. As she began implementing defensive measures, Jessica felt the familiar rush of applying skills that had been dormant for too long. For the first time in 14 months, she was doing the work she'd been trained for, using capabilities that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The afternoon passed in intense concentration as she built layers of protection around critical communication systems, each defensive measure designed to counter specific attack vectors that standard security protocols would miss. Her countermeasures were invisible to routine monitoring, but they would activate automatically when the cyber assault began, turning the attacker's own techniques against them. By 1700 hours, she had completed the first phase of her defensive preparations. The cyber terrorists would find their carefully planned assault countered by techniques they wouldn't recognize and couldn't defeat without months of additional preparation. American forces in the field would maintain secure communications during the night's critical operations, unaware that their lives had been saved by a woman their own institution had dismissed as barely competent to handle routine maintenance. The only question remaining was whether she could complete her work before someone discovered that the invisible IT support technician was actually conducting the most sophisticated cyber warfare operations in Fort Cascade's history. The emergency alert that pierced the evening calm at Fort Cascade at 1847 hours wasn't the routine communication check that Jessica had been expecting. The klaxon's harsh wail echoed through the mountain facility's corridors, sending personnel scrambling to their duty stations with the urgent efficiency that marked genuine crisis response rather than scheduled exercises. Jessica's hands froze over her keyboard in the secure server room where she had been implementing the final layers of her cyber defense network. The timing was wrong. The attack wasn't supposed to begin for another 2 hours, according to her analysis of the infiltrators' preparation patterns. Either her calculations had been incorrect, or the cyber terrorists had accelerated their timeline in response to something that had triggered their operational urgency. Staff Sergeant Chun burst through the server room door with barely controlled panic written across his features, his usual measured composure replaced by the kind of tactical alertness that indicated immediate threats requiring instant response. Behind him, the corridor filled with the sound of running footsteps and urgent radio chatter as Fort Cascade's personnel responded to whatever crisis had triggered the facility-wide alert. "Jessica, we have a problem," Chun announced, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone delivering information under combat conditions. Operations just lost contact with 3 forward operating bases supporting Desert Shield. Complete communication blackout across multiple installations in the operational theater. The implications hit Jessica like physical blows as she processed information that confirmed her worst analytical projections. The cyber attack hadn't been delayed or prevented by her defensive measures. It had begun ahead of schedule, targeting communication nodes that her protections hadn't yet reached. American forces in active combat operations were already experiencing the coordination failures that would result in casualties measured in dozens, possibly hundreds of lives. "How long ago?" she asked, her training automatically prioritizing information that would determine response options and timeline constraints. 17 minutes. Operations is trying to establish backup communications, but standard protocols aren't working. Whatever hit those bases took out primary and secondary systems simultaneously. Jessica's analysis crystallized with terrifying clarity. The cyber terrorists had modified their attack pattern, beginning with surgical strikes against forward operating bases before targeting the primary communication infrastructure. By the time her defensive measures activated, critical nodes would already be compromised, leaving gaps in the network that would take hours to restore using conventional recovery procedures. "Michael, I need you to get me access to the primary communication control room immediately. Not routine maintenance access, full operational authority to implement emergency countermeasures." Chun studied her expression, recognizing the tactical focus that indicated someone shifting from preparation to active engagement. "Jessica, that level of access requires command authorization. Captain Morrison would need to approve emergency protocols, and she's going to want explanations about why an IT support technician needs operational control over critical communication systems. Then we need to convince Captain Morrison that the person she thinks is barely qualified to handle password resets is actually the only person in this facility who understands the nature of the threats we're facing and possesses the technical capabilities to counter them effectively." The walk to the Command Operations Center took them through corridors filled with personnel responding to crisis conditions with varying degrees of competence and understanding. Junior enlisted soldiers moved with urgent purpose while clearly lacking comprehension of the situation's severity. Senior officers huddled in intense conversations that revealed their confusion about threats that fell outside their conventional military training. Captain Morrison occupied the center of controlled chaos in the operations room, surrounded by communication technicians, struggling to re-establish contact with forward bases using procedures that had been designed for equipment failures rather than sophisticated cyber warfare. Her expression combined professional determination with underlying concern that suggested she understood the gravity of the situation without fully comprehending its technical complexity. "Chun, Rodriguez." Morrison acknowledged their arrival with the distracted attention of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. "If you're here about routine maintenance issues, they'll have to wait." We're dealing with communication failures that are affecting active combat operations. Jessica stepped forward with decision that would either validate her hidden capabilities or destroy her carefully maintained anonymity forever. Captain, I believe I can re-establish communications with the affected bases, but I'll need operational access to primary systems and authorization to implement countermeasures that aren't covered in standard protocols. Morrison's expression shifted from distraction to focused attention as she processed the unexpected assertion from someone whose official qualifications suggested basic technical support rather than advanced cyber warfare capabilities. Rodriguez, what exactly are you telling me? I'm telling you that the communication failures aren't equipment problems. They're the result of a coordinated cyber attack designed to cripple military communications during active operations. The attackers are using advanced persistent threat techniques that won't be countered by standard recovery procedures. The operations room fell silent as personnel absorbed information that redefined their understanding of both the crisis and the person delivering the analysis. Morrison studied Jessica's expression with the calculating attention of someone who had learned to evaluate personnel under pressure conditions that revealed true capabilities rather than official qualifications. Rodriguez, how do you know this? Because I've been tracking the attack preparation for the past 8 hours, and I've identified the techniques and timing that indicate professional cyber warfare operations designed specifically to target Desert Shield communications during tonight's critical operational phase. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that challenged everything she thought she knew about her personnel and their capabilities. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone making decisions that would have consequences extending far beyond immediate operational requirements. Staff Sergeant Chun, what's your assessment of Specialist Rodriguez's technical capabilities based on your direct observation of her work? Chun's response came without hesitation, delivered with the professional certainty of someone who had spent months observing exceptional performance disguised as routine maintenance. Captain, every system that Rodriguez maintains operates at efficiency levels that exceed manufacturer specifications. Her diagnostic procedures identify problems before they become critical failures. Based on direct observation, her technical expertise significantly exceeds what her current position requires. Morrison turned back to Jessica, her expression revealing the kind of tactical calculation that marked experienced officers making critical decisions under pressure. Rodriguez, if I give you operational access to primary systems, what exactly are you planning to do? I'm going to implement countermeasures that will restore communications with affected bases and protect remaining systems from continued attack. The techniques I'll use aren't covered in standard operating procedures because they're based on advanced cyber warfare training that isn't part of conventional military education. What kind of advanced training? Jessica took a breath that would either save lives or end her military career. Delta Force Communications Specialist, 3 years active in unconventional operations, trained in cyber warfare techniques that most military personnel don't know exist. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the urgent chatter of radio communications as personnel continued their futile attempts to re-establish contact using conventional procedures. Morrison's expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and what might have been relief as she processed information that suddenly made sense of months of exceptional performance that had been inexplicable within the context of official personnel records. Why isn't this training reflected in your file? Because I was reassigned after developing solutions that exceeded what my superiors considered appropriate for someone of my rank and background. The official determination was that my methods were unconventional and inconsistent with established procedures. Morrison absorbed this information with the grim understanding of someone who had encountered institutional politics that prioritized conformity over competence. Around them, the operations room continued its urgent but ineffective response to communication failures that were beyond the scope of conventional technical solutions. "Sergeant Major Hayes," Morrison called across the room, her voice carrying command authority that cut through the ambient chaos. "I need you to authorize emergency operational access for Specialist Rodriguez to primary communication systems." Sergeant Major Hayes appeared with the territorial aggressiveness of someone whose authority was being challenged by circumstances beyond his understanding or control. His expression revealed immediate resistance to suggestions that someone he had spent months dismissing might possess capabilities that exceeded his own comprehension. "Captain, with respect, Rodriguez's IT support personnel. Operational access to primary systems requires qualified technicians with appropriate clearance levels and demonstrated competence in critical infrastructure management." Morrison's response carried the cold precision of someone who had run out of patience for institutional politics during active crisis conditions. "Sergeant Major, we have communication failures affecting combat operations and 3 forward bases that have been dark for 23 minutes. Specialist Rodriguez has identified the cause as coordinated cyber attack and claims the ability to implement countermeasures. Do you have alternative solutions that will restore communications faster?" Hayes hesitated, recognizing that his objections were based on procedural preferences rather than practical alternatives. Around them, conventional recovery efforts continued to fail while American forces in the field remained without communication support during active engagement with enemy forces. "Sir, I recommend we follow established protocols for communication recovery rather than experimental procedures from unqualified personnel." Jessica stepped forward, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure conditions that revealed true competence rather than bureaucratic rank. "Sergeant Major, the established protocols are failing because they weren't designed to counter the sophisticated cyber warfare techniques being used against our systems. Every minute we spend following procedures that can't address the actual problem is another minute that troops in the field remain without communication support. Rodriguez, you're out of line. You don't have the authority or qualifications to make tactical assessments about communication recovery procedures." Morrison intervened with command decision that cut through the territorial dispute. "Sergeant Major, authorization is granted. Rodriguez, you have operational access to primary systems. Implement whatever countermeasures are necessary to restore communications with affected bases." Jessica moved to the primary communication console with fluid efficiency, her hands finding controls with the automatic precision of someone who had trained extensively on similar systems under conditions where technical failures meant operational disasters. The interface responded to her touch with immediate recognition that someone with genuine expertise was finally implementing solutions designed to address actual problems rather than theoretical procedures. Her fingers moved across multiple keyboards simultaneously, executing commands that traced the cyber attack's penetration vectors, while implementing countermeasures that would neutralize the infiltrator's access and restore system integrity. The techniques she employed were invisible to standard, monitoring but devastating to attackers who hadn't anticipated defensive measures developed through advanced unconventional warfare training. As she worked, Jessica felt the familiar rush of applying skills that had been dormant for too long, using capabilities that represented years of specialized training, finally directed toward problems that matched her actual expertise. For the first time in 14 months, she was doing the work she had been trained for under conditions that required everything she had learned during her years in special operations. The first breakthrough came at 1934 hours when she successfully restored partial communications with Forward Operating Base Alpha, re-establishing contact that had been severed for 47 minutes during active combat operations. Her restoration procedures bypassed the compromised primary systems, routing communications through secured backup networks that the cyber attackers hadn't identified or penetrated. "Contact re-established with FOB Alpha," announced the communication. "Technician monitoring restoration efforts. They report heavy contact with enemy forces and urgent requirement for artillery support coordination." Morrison moved to the communication station, her relief evident as she coordinated with field commanders who had been operating without communication support during the most dangerous phase of their mission. The restoration of contact meant that troops under fire could again receive the coordination and support that might prevent casualties from friendly fire incidents and delayed medical evacuation. Jessica continued her systematic counterattack against the cyber infiltrators, using techniques that turned their own penetration methods against them, while restoring system integrity across the communication network. Her approach was surgical and decisive, eliminating threats while preserving operational capabilities that conventional recovery methods would have destroyed in the process of clearing compromised systems. The second breakthrough came 26 minutes later when she re-established contact with Forward Operating Base Charlie, ending a communication blackout that had left an entire company of infantry without coordination support during a planned offensive operation. The timing was critical. The operation had been delayed due to communication failures, but could now proceed with proper artillery and air support coordination. Sergeant Major Hayes watched Jessica's work with expression that cycled through confusion, recognition, and what might have been professional respect as he observed technical expertise that far exceeded anything he had encountered during his 25 years of military service. Her restoration procedures were accomplishing in minutes what conventional methods would require hours to achieve, using techniques that he couldn't understand but couldn't argue with based on the results. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, approaching her workstation as she continued implementing countermeasures against ongoing cyber attacks. "Where did you learn to do this?" Jessica glanced up from her work, her hands continuing their precise manipulation of controls, while she addressed the question that would determine how her revelations were received by personnel who had spent months assuming she was barely competent to handle basic technical support. 3 years of Delta Force training in unconventional cyber warfare, Sergeant Major. Techniques that most military personnel never encounter because they're classified at levels that require special authorization and demonstrated need to know. Hayes nodded slowly, pieces of an incomprehensible puzzle finally falling into place as he understood that months of exceptional maintenance results and inexplicable technical insights had been the visible evidence of capabilities that far exceeded what her position should have required. "Why weren't we told about your background?" "Because institutional politics decided that my techniques were too unconventional for integration with standard procedures. I was reassigned to positions where my actual capabilities couldn't challenge established protocols or threaten anyone's assumptions about proper technical procedures." The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone in the operations room. The same institution that had buried her talents because they exceeded comfortable parameters was now depending on those exceptional capabilities to prevent communication failures that could result in catastrophic casualties during active combat operations. By 2,147 hours, Jessica had successfully restored communications with all affected forward operating bases and implemented comprehensive countermeasures that would prevent continued cyber attacks against military communication networks supporting Operation Desert Shield. Her defensive measures were invisible to routine monitoring but devastating to attackers who found their carefully planned assault neutralized by techniques they couldn't recognize or counter. The transformation in the operations room was dramatic and undeniable. Personnel who had observed months of routine technical support suddenly understood that they had been working alongside someone whose capabilities rivaled those of the military's most elite specialists. The woman they had dismissed as barely competent to handle password resets had just prevented communication failures that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties during active combat operations. Captain Morrison approached Jessica's workstation. As she completed the final phase of her countermeasures, her expression combining professional gratitude with tactical curiosity about capabilities that had been hidden beneath carefully maintained anonymity. "Rodriguez, I need to understand something. The countermeasures you've implemented, the techniques you've used to restore communications and prevent continued attacks, these aren't methods that appear in any technical manual I've encountered." "No, ma'am, they're based on classified training in advanced cyber warfare that most military personnel don't receive. The techniques work because they approach network security from perspectives that conventional training doesn't address." Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing implications that would require careful consideration about how Jessica's revelations would be reported through channels that weren't prepared for personnel whose actual capabilities exceeded their official qualifications by such dramatic margins. "Rodriguez, you've just prevented what could have been a catastrophic communication failure during active combat operations. The lives you've saved tonight can't be counted because the casualties you prevented never occurred. That level of contribution deserves recognition that matches the significance of your actions." Jessica looked around the operations room where personnel were returning to normal operational procedures now that the crisis had been resolved. For the first time in 14 months, she had been able to use her training for its intended purpose, applying skills that had been developed specifically for situations where conventional solutions would fail and lives depended on exceptional capabilities applied under pressure. The question that would determine her future was whether the institution that had buried her talents for political reasons would now recognize the value of capabilities that had just proven their worth under the most demanding circumstances possible. The invisible woman had finally been seen, but whether that visibility would result in vindication or continued persecution remained to be determined by decisions that would be made far above the level of Fort Cascade's command structure. The secure conference room at Fort Cascade had never hosted a meeting quite like the one that convened at 0630 hours, the morning after Jessica Rodriguez prevented what intelligence analysts were already calling the most sophisticated cyber attack against military communications in operational history. Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Pentagon's Cyber Warfare Division had arrived via emergency transport during the night, accompanied by investigators whose credentials suggested they possessed authority that extended far beyond routine military oversight. Jessica sat at the polished conference table, feeling simultaneously vindicated and vulnerable, aware that the next few hours would determine whether her actions would be celebrated as heroic or investigated as unauthorized activities that violated established protocols. The presence of Colonel Mitchell indicated that her revelation of advanced capabilities had triggered interest at levels where careers were made or destroyed based on decisions that balanced operational effectiveness against institutional conformity. Colonel Mitchell possessed the kind of quiet authority that marked officers who had risen through the ranks by demonstrating competence under conditions where failure had strategic consequences. At 45, she moved with the controlled precision of someone who had spent years making decisions about cyber warfare, capabilities that most military personnel didn't know existed. Her expression revealed professional curiosity mixed with tactical calculation as she reviewed files that painted a dramatically different picture of Jessica's background than anything reflected in official personnel records. "Specialist Rodriguez," Mitchell began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone conducting an investigation that would have implications extending far beyond individual accountability. "Your actions last night prevented communication failures that could have resulted in significant casualties during active combat operations. However, those same actions raise questions about capabilities and training that aren't reflected in your current assignment or personnel file." Captain Morrison sat across from Jessica, her expression combining support with concern about how the investigation might affect her own command decisions regarding personnel whose qualifications she had clearly misjudged. The presence of Pentagon. Investigators in her conference room indicated that routine explanation would be insufficient to address questions about how someone with Jessica's demonstrated capabilities had been assigned to basic technical support duties. Colonel, I want to state for the record that Specialist Rodriguez's performance during the crisis was exceptional, Morrison said. Her technical expertise and tactical decision-making under pressure prevented what could have been catastrophic communication failures during active military operations. Mitchell nodded acknowledgement, while consulting documents that suggested she already possessed comprehensive information about the previous night's events. Captain Morrison, your support for Specialist Rodriguez is noted. However, the techniques she employed to counter the cyber attack indicate training and capabilities that significantly exceed what her current position should require. That discrepancy requires explanation. Jessica recognized the moment of truth that would determine how her revelations were received by institutions that had previously deemed her methods inappropriate for integration with established protocols. She could offer limited explanations that protected her carefully maintained anonymity, or she could provide complete disclosure that might validate her capabilities while exposing institutional failures that some officials would prefer to keep buried. Colonel, my background includes 3 years as a Delta Force communications specialist trained in advanced cyber warfare techniques that aren't part of conventional military education. I was reassigned to my current position after an incident at the Cyber Warfare Academy, where my solutions were deemed unconventional and inconsistent with established procedures. Mitchell's expression sharpened with professional interest as she processed information that explained months of exceptional performance that had been incomprehensible within the context of official records. Tell me about this incident at the Academy. Jessica took a breath that would either vindicate years of suppressed capabilities or provide evidence for charges of insubordination that could end her military career. During training exercises, I developed penetration techniques that consistently outperformed established protocols. Instead of recognizing innovation, my commanding officer concluded that I must be violating security procedures or receiving unauthorized assistance. The subsequent investigation determined my methods were unsuitable for integration with standard operational protocols. Who was your commanding officer at the Academy? Colonel James Patterson, currently assigned to the Pentagon Strategic Cyber Command. Mitchell made notes that suggested she was familiar with Patterson and his approach to personnel who challenged conventional methodologies. Her expression revealed the kind of tactical calculation that indicated she understood the institutional dynamics that could result in exceptional personnel being buried in assignments that wasted their capabilities. Specialist Rodriguez, I need you to understand that your actions last night have triggered interest at levels where decisions about cyber warfare capabilities are made with consideration for strategic implications that extend beyond individual cases. Your demonstration of advanced techniques has raised questions about how many other qualified personnel might be underutilized due to institutional biases that prioritize conformity over competence. The implications weren't lost on anyone in the conference room. Jessica's case represented potential evidence of systematic problems with personnel evaluation that could indicate widespread waste of technical expertise during periods when cyber warfare capabilities were increasingly critical to national security. Staff Sergeant Chun entered the conference room, carrying files that suggested he had spent the night documenting Jessica's work with the detailed precision required for official reports. His expression combined professional respect with underlying concern about how institutional politics might respond to evidence that challenged established assumptions about personnel evaluation and assignment procedures. Colonel Mitchell, you requested documentation of Specialist Rodriguez's technical activities over the past several months. Chun announced, distributing reports that revealed patterns of exceptional performance that had been consistently attributed to routine maintenance rather than innovative engineering. Mitchell reviewed Chun's documentation with growing attention, her expression revealing recognition of capabilities that far exceeded what Jessica's official position should have required. The maintenance records showed system improvements that indicated comprehensive understanding of network architecture and security protocols that most technical personnel never encountered during conventional training. Staff Sergeant Chun, based on your direct observation of Specialist Rodriguez's work, what's your professional assessment of her technical capabilities compared to other personnel you've worked with during your military career? Chun's response came without hesitation, delivered with the professional certainty of someone who had spent months observing exceptional performance that defied easy categorization. Colonel, Specialist Rodriguez's technical expertise exceeds that of any personnel I've encountered during 12 years of military service. Her diagnostic procedures identify problems that our most advanced monitoring systems miss, and her solutions, CONSIS, TNTL, improve system performance beyond manufacturer specifications. Mitchell absorbed this assessment while consulting additional files that painted a comprehensive picture of Jessica's background and capabilities. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone making decisions about institutional policies that would affect personnel evaluation procedures across multiple commands. Specialist Rodriguez, the cyber attack you countered last night was conducted by foreign intelligence operatives using techniques that represent the most sophisticated threat to military communications that we've encountered. Your countermeasures not only prevented immediate damage but provided intelligence about enemy capabilities that will enhance our defensive posture for months to come. The recognition was gratifying, but Jessica understood that praise from Pentagon officials often preceded questions about how exceptional performance had been possible, despite institutional barriers that should have prevented such capabilities from being available when needed. Colonel, I want to emphasize that my ability to counter the attack was based entirely on training that I received during my assignment to Delta Force. The techniques I used are documented in classified protocols that most military personnel never encounter, but they're standard procedures for unconventional warfare specialists. Mitchell nodded understanding, while making additional notes that suggested she was building a comprehensive case about Jessica's background and capabilities. Who was your training officer during your Delta Force assignment? Master Sergeant David Walsh, currently assigned to the Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg. Mitchell's expression revealed immediate recognition of Walsh's reputation within the Special Operations community. I'm familiar with Master Sergeant Walsh's training programs. His students are considered among the most technically proficient specialists in unconventional cyber warfare. The validation was more significant than Jessica had expected. Walsh's reputation within elite military circles meant that his training carried credibility that transcended institutional politics about unconventional techniques and innovative solutions. Colonel, if I may, Morrison interjected, I think it's important to note that Specialist Rodriguez's exceptional performance wasn't limited to last night's crisis. Her routine maintenance work has consistently resulted in system improvements that our technical staff couldn't explain based on her official qualifications. Mitchell turned her attention to Morrison with interest that suggested she understood the broader implications of institutional failures that resulted in exceptional personnel being assigned to positions that wasted their capabilities. Captain Morrison, how long has Specialist Rodriguez been assigned to your command? 14 months, Colonel. During that time, every system she's maintained has operated at efficiency levels that exceed our baseline performance metrics. Her work has prevented 3 major system failures and countless minor disruptions that would have affected operational readiness. And during those 14 months, did anyone investigate why her maintenance results were consistently superior to those achieved by personnel with supposedly equivalent qualifications? Morrison's uncomfortable silence provided answer enough. The institutional assumption had been that exceptional results were due to luck or circumstances rather than capabilities that exceeded official qualifications by dramatic margins. Mitchell continued her systematic documentation of institutional failures that had resulted in waste of technical expertise during periods when cyber warfare capabilities were becoming increasingly critical to military effectiveness. Captain Morrison, what procedures are in place to identify personnel whose actual capabilities exceed their official assignments? Colonel, we rely primarily on personnel files and official training records to determine appropriate assignments and responsibilities. And when those files are incomplete or inaccurate due to institutional biases or political considerations. Morrison's expression revealed recognition of systematic problems that extended far beyond individual cases of misassigned personnel. The institutional reliance on official documentation meant that capabilities suppressed for political reasons would remain hidden indefinitely unless circumstances forced their revelation. Colonel Mitchell turned back to Jessica with expression that combined professional respect with tactical concern about implications that extended beyond immediate personnel decisions. Specialist Rodriguez, I need to ask you directly about your intentions regarding continued military service. Given your treatment over the past 14 months, many personnel in your situation would consider civilian opportunities that might offer better recognition of their capabilities. Jessica had anticipated this question during the sleepless hours between the crisis resolution and the morning's investigation. Her answer would determine not only her personal future, but also whether the military would retain capabilities that had just proven their critical importance under combat conditions. Colonel, I joined the military to serve my country and use my skills to protect other soldiers. That commitment hasn't changed despite the institutional politics that have characterized my recent assignments. However, I do expect that my continued service will be in positions that utilize my actual capabilities rather than wasting them on assignments that anyone with basic technical training could handle. Mitchell's expression revealed approval of an answer that demonstrated both personal integrity and professional pragmatism. Specialist Rodriguez, based on your demonstrated capabilities and the critical importance of advanced cyber warfare expertise to current military operations, I'm recommending your immediate reassignment to positions that match your actual qualifications. The recommendation represented vindication that Jessica had been pursuing for 14 months, but it also raised questions about how institutional changes would prevent similar waste of technical expertise in the future. What kind of reassignment are you considering, Colonel? Advanced Cyber Warfare Specialist with the Pentagon Strategic Cyber Command, working directly with Master Sergeant Walsh on developing countermeasures against the sophisticated threats we're encountering with increasing frequency. The assignment would represent not only personal vindication, but also return to the kind of work that Jessica had been trained to perform under conditions where technical excellence was measured by operational effectiveness rather than conformity to bureaucratic preferences. Sergeant Major Hayes entered the conference room with expression that combined professional embarrassment with grudging respect for capabilities that had been demonstrated beyond any possibility of denial. His presence indicated that institutional accountability would extend to personnel whose biases had contributed to waste of critical technical expertise. Colonel Mitchell, Hayes announced, you requested my assessment of Specialist Rodriguez's performance during her assignment to this command. Mitchell consulted her notes with expression that suggested she already possessed comprehensive information about Hayes's treatment of Jessica during the previous 14 months. Sergeant Major Hayes, please describe your professional interactions with Specialist Rodriguez and your evaluation of her technical capabilities. Hayes hesitated, recognizing that his previous assessments would be evaluated in light of Jessica's demonstrated expertise during the previous night's crisis. His institutional authority had been built on assumptions about personnel capabilities that had just been revealed as fundamentally inaccurate. Colonel, I based my evaluation of Specialist Rodriguez on her official personnel file and training records. Her maintenance work was consistently satisfactory, and she followed established procedures for routine technical support activities. Sergeant Major. Consistently satisfactory seems like an inadequate description of performance that prevented 3 major system failures and achieved efficiency improvements that exceeded baseline metrics by significant margins. Hayes's uncomfortable silence revealed recognition that his evaluation criteria had been designed to identify conformity rather than excellence. Missing capabilities that were demonstrated through results that exceeded expectations by dramatic margins. Mitchell continued her systematic documentation of institutional failures with the methodical precision of someone building a comprehensive case about personnel evaluation procedures that required fundamental reform. Sergeant Major. Hayes, what training have you received in identifying advanced technical capabilities among personnel assigned to your command? Colonel. My evaluation procedures are based on established protocols for assessing technical competence, according to military occupational specialty requirements, and demonstrated adherence to standard operating procedures. And when those protocols fail to identify exceptional capabilities that exceed standard requirements? Hayes's expression revealed dawning recognition that his evaluation methods had been designed for routine personnel management rather than identification of exceptional capabilities that could provide critical advantages during operational crises. Colonel Mitchell concluded her investigation with decisions that would affect not only Jessica's immediate future, but also institutional policies about personnel evaluation and assignment procedures. Her recommendations would trigger changes that extended far beyond individual accountability to address systematic problems that had resulted in waste of technical expertise when cyber warfare capabilities were becoming increasingly critical to military effectiveness. Based on this investigation, I'm making the following recommendations, Mitchell announced. Specialist Rodriguez will be immediately promoted to Staff Sergeant and reassigned to advanced cyber warfare duties with Strategic Cyber Command. Additionally, I'm recommending comprehensive review of personnel evaluation procedures to identify other qualified individuals who may be underutilized due to institutional biases or incomplete documentation of their actual capabilities. The transformation was dramatic and undeniable. Within 18 hours, Jessica had progressed from invisible technical support to recognized cyber warfare specialist with assignment to duties that matched her actual training and capabilities. The institutional recognition represented vindication that had been delayed by political considerations, but could no longer be denied in light of demonstrated performance under combat conditions. As the investigation concluded and personnel prepared to implement the recommended changes, Jessica reflected on the journey from suppressed capabilities to institutional recognition that had been triggered by her willingness to risk personal consequences to prevent casualties that only she possessed the skills to prevent. The invisible woman had finally been seen, and the institutional response would determine whether exceptional capabilities would be nurtured or continued to be wasted through evaluation procedures that prioritize conformity over competence that could save lives when conventional solutions failed. 6 months after the cyber attack that changed everything, Staff Sergeant Jessica Rodriguez stood in the Pentagon's Strategic Cyber Command Center, watching her latest class of military cyber warfare specialists conduct advanced penetration testing, exercises that would have been impossible to imagine during her exile at Fort Cascade. The facility hummed with the controlled energy of personnel who understood that their technical expertise could determine the difference between operational success and catastrophic failure when American forces face sophisticated digital threats. In hostile environments, the transformation had been comprehensive and irreversible. Jessica now served as the lead instructor for the military's most advanced cyber warfare training program, developing curricula that identified and nurtured technical capabilities regardless of conventional assumptions about background, gender, or institutional conformity. Her methods had revolutionized personnel evaluation procedures across multiple commands, ensuring that exceptional abilities would be recognized and utilized rather than buried beneath bureaucratic preferences for predictable mediocrity. Master Sergeant David Walsh approached her observation station with the satisfied expression of someone who had watched a protege exceed even optimistic expectations about professional development and institutional impact. At 52, Walsh had spent 3 decades identifying and training personnel whose capabilities could provide critical advantages during unconventional operations. But Jessica's case represented validation of principles about human potential that challenged fundamental assumptions about military talent management. Outstanding work on the Advanced Persistent Threat Simulation, Walsh commented, reviewing performance metrics from the training exercise that Jessica had designed to test capabilities under conditions that replicated real-world cyber warfare. Scenarios. Your students are achieving penetration success rates that exceed those of personnel with twice their experience and conventional training. Jessica monitored her students' progress with the professional satisfaction of someone who understood that excellence could be taught and developed when institutional barriers were removed and training focused on results rather than conformity to established procedures. The diverse group of specialists included personnel whose backgrounds would have excluded them from advanced training under previous evaluation criteria, but whose demonstrated capabilities now contributed to the military's most sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. The key is teaching them to think like their adversaries rather than memorizing defensive procedures, Jessica explained, watching as one of her students successfully bypassed security measures that had stumped more EXPERIENC ED analysts. Conventional training teaches people to follow protocols. Advanced warfare requires innovation that anticipates threats before they're fully developed. The Pentagon's cyber warfare facility represented everything that Fort Cascade had failed to provide during Jessica's months of institutional exile. State-of-the-art equipment, unlimited access to classified threat intelligence, and most importantly, colleagues who measured success by operational effectiveness rather than adherence to bureaucratic expectations that prioritized predictability over performance. General Patricia Sullivan entered the training facility with the commanding presence that had characterized her rise to become the military's senior authority on cyber warfare strategy and implementation. At 58, Sullivan embodied the institutional transformation that Jessica's case had catalyzed, leading efforts to identify and develop technical capabilities that could provide decisive advantages in conflicts where conventional military superiority might be neutralized by sophisticated digital attacks. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sullivan announced, approaching the training area where Jessica continued monitoring her students' exercise performance. I have some news that will interest you about the broader impact of the reforms we've implemented. Since your reassignment, Jessica stepped away from her monitoring station, recognizing the formal tone that indicated official communication about institutional changes that extended far beyond individual personnel decisions. Sullivan's presence suggested developments at policy levels, where decisions affected training and evaluation procedures across the entire military establishment. General, what kind of impact are we seeing? We've identified over 300 military personnel whose actual capabilities significantly exceed their current assignments, including 47 individuals with advanced technical training, who were relegated to basic support duties due to evaluation procedures that missed or dismissed their qualifications. The numbers represented validation of Jessica's suspicions that her case wasn't isolated, but symptomatic of systematic problems with personnel management that had been wasting critical expertise during periods when technical superiority was becoming increasingly important to military effectiveness. How many of them are being reassigned to positions that match their actual capabilities? All of them, Sullivan replied with satisfaction that indicated comprehensive institutional commitment to reform rather than superficial adjustments designed to address public relations concerns. We're implementing evaluation procedures that identify excellence regardless of background characteristics that have traditionally influenced personnel decisions. Jessica felt the professional satisfaction of someone whose personal vindication had triggered changes that would benefit countless others who had faced similar institutional barriers. The transformation represented more than individual recognition. It demonstrated that exceptional performance could force institutional evolution when circumstances made the costs of continued mediocrity impossible to ignore. Colonel Sarah Mitchell joined their conversation with reports that detailed the strategic implications of personnel reforms that had been implemented across multiple commands. Her expression revealed professional pride in institutional changes that enhanced military capabilities, while addressing systematic injustices that had been tolerated for decades due to bureaucratic inertia and cultural resistance to non-traditional excellence. "Jessica, I thought you'd want to know about Colonel Patterson's current status," Mitchell said, referencing the officer whose biases had derailed Jessica's career at the Cyber Warfare Academy. "He's been relieved of command and reassigned to administrative duties pending investigation of discriminatory personnel practices that affected multiple individuals under his supervision." The accountability represented justice that extended beyond Jessica's individual case to address institutional patterns that had damaged careers and wasted capabilities for reasons that had nothing to do with operational effectiveness or professional competence. What about the others who were affected by his decisions? Comprehensive review and appropriate reassignments for everyone whose careers were damaged by his evaluation procedures. The military is committed to ensuring that institutional biases don't prevent us from utilizing the full range of available talent. Jessica nodded acknowledgement while observing her students complete the final phase of their training exercise with success rates that validated her instructional methods and demonstrated the potential that could be unleashed when evaluation procedures focused on capabilities rather than conformity to traditional expectations about appropriate backgrounds for advanced technical positions. The transformation at Fort Cascade had been equally comprehensive. Captain Morrison now commanded a communications facility that served as a model for personnel evaluation and utilization procedures that identified excellence, regardless of conventional assumptions about appropriate qualifications for critical positions. Sergeant Major Hayes had been transferred to training duties, where his experience could contribute to educational programs rather than personnel evaluation that had consistently failed to recognize exceptional capabilities. Staff Sergeant Chun had received his own promotion and reassignment to advanced signal intelligence duties that matched his analytical capabilities and technical expertise. His recognition represented institutional acknowledgement that exceptional performance should be rewarded regardless of the unofficial nature of activities that had demonstrated competence beyond official job requirements. As Jessica's training exercise concluded and her students began documenting their successful penetration of simulated enemy networks, she reflected on the journey from institutional invisibility to recognized expertise that had been triggered by her willingness to risk personal consequences to prevent casualties that only she possessed the skills to avoid. The afternoon briefing in the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Facility brought together personnel whose diverse backgrounds represented the new approach to talent identification and development that Jessica's case had helped establish. The room included cyber warfare specialists, signal intelligence analysts, and communications experts whose capabilities had been identified and nurtured through evaluation procedures that measured performance rather than conformity to traditional career progression patterns. The latest intelligence indicates that our adversaries are developing increasingly sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities designed to neutralize conventional military advantages through attacks on communication and coordination systems. General Sullivan announced, presenting threat assessments that underscored the critical importance of advanced technical expertise for national security. Jessica studied the intelligence reports with professional interest that reflected her current role in developing countermeasures against evolving threats. The sophisticated nature of enemy capabilities validated her long-held belief that military technical training needed to exceed conventional parameters to maintain effective defensive and offensive capabilities in digital warfare environments. General, the threat patterns we're seeing suggest coordination between multiple hostile intelligence services, sharing advanced techniques and targeting information, Jessica observed. Our countermeasures need to anticipate cooperation between adversaries who traditionally operated independently. Sullivan nodded recognition of analysis that demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that conventional training often failed to develop. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, that assessment aligns with intelligence from other sources. We need personnel who can think beyond traditional threat models to develop innovative defensive measures. The strategic discussion continued with contributions from specialists whose diverse backgrounds and unconventional career paths had been identified through reformed evaluation procedures that recognized excellence, regardless of traditional qualifications or institutional expectations about appropriate personnel for advanced technical positions. As the briefing concluded and participants dispersed to implement defensive measures against evolving cyber threats, Jessica remained in the planning facility for a few additional minutes, processing the magnitude of changes that had been triggered by her decision to act when conventional procedures would have failed and lives were at stake. Master Sergeant Walsh approached as she gathered her materials, his expression combining personal pride with professional satisfaction about institutional reforms that would benefit future generations of military technical specialists. Jessica, I want you to know that your case has become required study material at the Cyber Warfare Academy, Walsh said. Future officers will learn about the importance of recognizing and utilizing exceptional capabilities regardless of the institutional barriers that might obscure them. The recognition represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated that exceptional performance could establish precedents that would guide future personnel decisions and prevent similar waste of critical capabilities when military effectiveness depended on technical expertise that exceeded conventional training parameters. Master Sergeant, the most important lesson isn't about individual recognition, Jessica replied. It's about institutional commitment to identifying and developing excellence wherever it exists, regardless of whether it fits traditional expectations about appropriate backgrounds for critical positions. Walsh smiled with appreciation for perspective that demonstrated genuine understanding of leadership principles that transcended personal advancement to focus on institutional effectiveness and mission accomplishment. 6 months after preventing a cyber attack that could have resulted in catastrophic casualties during active military operations, Jessica Rodriguez had transformed from invisible support personnel to recognized expert whose training programs were reshaping military cyber warfare capabilities across multiple commands. The evening sunset through the Pentagon's windows painted the strategic planning facility in golden light that symbolized the new dawn of institutional recognition for excellence that had been achieved through performance rather than political considerations or traditional career progression patterns. As Jessica prepared to leave the facility where she now served as one of the military's most valued technical specialists, she reflected on the journey from institutional exile to professional vindication that had been possible only through willingness to risk personal consequences when lives depended on capabilities that conventional procedures couldn't provide. The invisible woman had not only been seen, but had become a catalyst for institutional transformation that would ensure future generations of military personnel would be evaluated based on their actual capabilities rather than bureaucratic assumptions. about appropriate qualifications for critical positions. The war against institutional mediocrity was far from over, but decisive battles had been won by demonstrating that exceptional performance could force recognition when circumstances made the costs of continued blindness impossible to ignore. Sometimes courage to act when action was unauthorized, but necessary, could change not just individual destinies, but entire institutional cultures that had been built on assumptions about human potential that limited rather than liberated the capabilities needed for mission success. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.